Hi, my name is Ken Young. I'm part of Professor Christensen's Accounting 3300 cost class, and this is my presentation on the research paper I did on ABC, or activity-based costing. And when I was doing this research paper, I basically wanted to learn how ABC worked in general, so I didn't get too deep into the application of it necessarily, but I learned at least the generals of how it works. And so really the goal in activity-based costing is kind of what its name implies, is you want to identify the activities that really go into the making of a product or a process, whatever your company is doing, in order to apply overhead or indirect costs more directly. And in this way you really see what a product actually costs, and this helps management make better decisions on things like pricing and production and product mixes. And to know what a product actually costs in making will help you make more profitable decisions. And so implementing ABC is a different process from company to company and industry to industry, because they are different, and so you'll need to tailor your implementation of it according to whatever your company is and whatever your product or process is. And you need to decide what the goal of your activity-based costing analysis is. Do you want to maximize profit or contribution margins? Do you want to maximize time spent? Things like this. You need to decide what resource you want to optimize. But there are some general steps that you should follow in implementing activity-based costing. The first of them would be to identify the activities, the general activities that go into creating a product. So this might be, actions of employees, or just certain things that happen along the way. And you can find this out by interviewing employees or looking at a workflow chart, something like that, to identify these activities. After that, you decide what the cost drivers are for these activities. And so this could be something like labor hours or resources used. Sometimes it's just time itself. What are the things that really drive these activities that make the product, and what are the things that bring cost into the equation? After that, you collect these activities that are similar, and you put them into homogeneous cost pools, and these cost pools are what you apply those cost drivers to. Similar activities with similar cost drivers will be grouped together. And then these activities in these cost pools need to be assigned what's called an activity level, and we'll get into that in a minute, about in what like groups or amounts costs are added to the product. Is it one by one? Is it a big batch? And we'll talk about that. And then after that, after you've decided these things, you decide how to apply the overhead and the indirect costs to these cost pools, and this is how you find out how to allocate it proportionally instead of peanut butter costing, where you just apply it evenly over everything, because that's not usually the case, and it's not a very accurate way of applying overhead. And so one example I came across was in the winemaking industry. It was really interesting. They separated their activities into three cost pools, basically. What was harvesting, the actual winemaking process, and the complementary processes that go into winemaking. And so those are the three activity pools that they decided on. And in the harvesting, there were things like selecting the grapes, actually harvesting the grapes, and transporting the grapes to the winery or the press, wherever they were going. And then there's the actual winemaking, which includes preparation for fermentation, the fermentation itself, and some of the processes that happen right after fermentation. And then complementary activity pool included things like bottling, labeling, the purification of the wine, those kinds of things. So now that you have certain activities that are divided into certain activity pools, you decide what the cost drivers are for those activity pools. And so the harvesting activity pool, with the harvesting of the grapes and the transporting them, that was determined. The cost driver would be the number of grapes used in kilograms, and so that's the cost driver for that pool. And the other two pools, the winemaking and the complementary, the cost driver for those were labor hours and materials. And so once you have those cost drivers, you can apply them and see what amount of the overhead cost should be applied to each of those activity pools. And so I mentioned activity levels earlier, and this is the grouping of how you apply costs and how value is added to a product along the value chain, really. And so first there is the unit level, and this means that products are added cost to them unit by unit, so one by one basically. And this is a pretty common way to do it. That's a common activity level. The next is batch level, which would be what it sounds like. There's a batch of products that you apply the cost to. You can't really separate out each individual unit with these kind of costs, and that would be like preparation in whatever process you have for a batch that needs to happen each batch. That doesn't necessarily apply to each unit itself. And then there's the product level, activity level, and these are costs that are applied to a specific product line itself as a whole, and things that support that product line. So like with gas tanks underground, they will be applied to the tanks that coincide with the regular gasoline and the premium gasoline, the cost of those tanks and those kinds of things. And then the facility level is kind of like product, but it's applied to everything in the facility itself that support the production of all products there, really. And so once you decide on how to apply the overhead based on what proportion of cost that those cost drivers bring to those activity levels and those activity pools, you can really see what a product actually costs. And this is where ABC analysis really helps managers in internal reporting, is they can see the actual cost of a product. And there are many cases in which you find out that something you thought was profitable using that peanut butter costing actually takes up more indirect cost or overhead cost than you applied to it. And so you're actually losing money on those products. And there were a couple examples in the food industry. There was an example with a Hong Kong buffet style restaurant that they applied overhead kind of evenly to all products, or all their food products and all their food processes. But when they separated these things out and applied activity-based costing, they found that they were actually losing money on a dinner buffet. They were losing money every time they sold one. The same thing happened with a fast food restaurant, where when you apply overhead and indirect costs evenly, most of the items on the menu seemed profitable and had a positive profit margin, contribution margin. But when you apply activity-based costing more proportionally to specific, more cost-driven items on the menu, it's found that a lot of them are actually not profitable and that they're losing money. And these kinds of things help a manager decide on what they should keep, what they should discontinue, what they should push more of, what their optimal product mix would be. These kinds of things, what activity-based costing is designed to do. So ABC isn't used for external reporting. It's used for internal decision making because it handles overhead in a different way than I think is GAAP allowed. But it is helpful internally, and it's a good process. So.